Poverty in Australia. I know what you're thinking. Poverty in Australia, as if. But poverty in Australia does exist, and over 13% of Australians are affected by it. To understand who is affected by poverty, a poverty line must be set in order to determine how much of the population is living in poverty. Therefore, there are two forms of poverty. The first is absolute poverty. This type is more commonly seen in third world countries, which an individual only makes $1 a day, and are generally limited to malnutrition.
The second is relative poverty, which is generally seen in first world countries such as Australia. Individuals who suffer from relative poverty usually make $50 a day. It might seem like a lot, but in these situations, it's all relative, especially in Australia, where people in poverty cannot provide for their family. We'll be talking to Charlotte, who asked to change her name for privacy reasons, and how she grew up with poverty in Australia.
My father's drinking definitely played a large role on his financial status. He also rents and will never have enough money to buy a house. A lot of his money is blown on drinking, and I think it's also starting to be blown on gambling, which isn't great. I think the main factors for my mother would be not attending uni and not investing in property. We have always rented, and my mother will never buy a house due to her current income status. My mother was on government assisted benefits when I was in primary school, but she is no longer on them despite trying to be. I think another factor would be the people that constantly surrounded me when I was growing up. As I mentioned, where we live, there is a large population of single mothers and low income earners, as they were the people that I would aspire to because it's all I ever knew. I also think that going to public schools had a large impact on my education, as many children at my schools, both primary and high, had learning difficulties or behavioural issues. All in all, I had a good childhood. I had some great friends and I have a good relationship with my mum. Despite that, it was obviously hard. My mum was always stressing about money, and we never got to do any exciting things that costed money, as we just couldn't afford it. I didn't feel different to everyone at school when I was growing up, as we were all in roughly the same situation. When I moved to high school, there were a few children who had wealthy families, so I felt different then. They had the luxuries that we never had, like going to the movies or shopping or theme park. They always had a car and a nice house, and their parents never seemed to be as stressed as mine. Poverty in Australia is very different to poverty in a third world country. People living in poverty in Australia still have a roof over their head and food on the table, but they don't experience many, if any, luxuries. People that live in poverty are often criticised and aren't respected. They are regularly looked down upon without people considering their circumstances. Many people, like my parents, are living in poverty due to poor choices in their childhood, but they really are doing the best they can, and that's what people don't realise. My driving focus to work hard is from the mistakes that my parents made when they were younger. I am currently a university student studying speech therapy. I also work as a nanny and in a retail store. I would like to cut my work hours down to focus on my studies more, but I have to pay rent and Sydney is very expensive. Morning, do you need any help today?
Poverty is a strong word, and when you hear it, images of starving children in developing nations come to mind, and we don't often hear about it in context with our nation. However, the systematic cycle that traps people who face poverty are at risk of developing mental illnesses that put them at the risk of remaining in poverty.
Over 1/3 of people living with a mental health illness survive on less than $20,000 a year. We spoke to Tracy, who works with patients in a mental health hospital within southwest Sydney and teaches on the subject at the University of Wollongong.
We get a range of clients. I would have to say a lot of them are from a lower socioeconomic status, and a lot of people are in Centrelink that also have a mental illness. So if you think about it, it does correlate to mental illness having a low socioeconomic status. For example, there is this young Indigenous girl that I've known for about 3 years now since working there, and she's a lovely girl. When you actually do talk to her, she's very likable and approachable, but because she has been brought up in such a dysfunctional family, her entire world and her way of understanding and perceiving the world is really distorted from, let's say, just anyone who's from a middle class family. The whole family has a substance misuse history, and she has grown up in that world where substance use is normal. Because of that, she has actually then grown up taking who knows what substances. Because of that whole low socioeconomic status, they actually didn't get the, don't want to say the proper education, but they were not educated on the impact of substances on their mental illness. So, and because the mom also has a mental illness, she was also predisposed to then developing a mental illness later on. So when she first presented, she was having drug-induced psychosis, and on each discharge, the same time, we were always worried that she's returning to the same situation at home. But the thing is, even if we removed her from her home state, she would actually return. Somehow her mother and her family would find her, and then they would then reintroduce her again to drugs. So the thing with this girl is she did express on several times, and she's gone to rehab. She wanted to stop using drugs. She wanted to get her life back together. That's her own words. But the thing is, no matter what, because of her background, her family, and her history of substance misuse, she always came back with the same presentation.
Poverty in Australia. There is such a thing. You can help Australians who suffer from poverty by becoming a member of ACOS, Australian Council of Social Service. By becoming a member, you'll be able to be part of campaigns, educate the public, and donate to those affected by poverty in Australia.
As an established developed nation, most of us naturally assume poverty doesn't affect our nation. But through stories like Charlotte's, we can see that poverty exists in Australia and has long-reaching effects. Poverty doesn't just exist in shores beyond ours, it exists in the untold struggles of people right at home.